Chapter 1. Introduction. The Myth of Napoleon. Hardly any other figure in European history has been so controversial, so admired, and at the same time so feared as Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a general and legislator, revolutionary and emperor, conqueror and reformer. His name stands for unparalleled fame as well as tragic doom. To this day, Napoleon is remembered in history books, novels, and films as one of those people who changed the course of history through their deeds, a man who came from a humble background and rose to become ruler of large parts of Europe. There are many reasons for Napoleon's fascination. On the one hand, he was a military genius. His victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram are among the most brilliant triumphs in military history. He led armies over mountains, through deserts, and into the vastness of Russia, always with an energy and determination that amazed his opponents. For his soldiers, he was the little corporal who marched with them and shared their deprivations, but at the same time, he was also the infallible strategist, able to turn seemingly hopeless situations into a victory. But Napoleon was much more than a general. His name is also associated with far-reaching reforms that continue to shape the face of Europe today. The Code Civil, his code of law, brought equality of law and abolished old feudal structures. He reformed the administration, centralized the state, founded schools and universities, and laid the foundations of a modern Europe. Even in the countries he did not rule permanently, he left his mark: administrative structures, legal systems, ideas of the nation, and civil rights. At the same time, his image remains contradictory. For the same man who made equality before the law and career according to talent possible, restricted freedom of the press, persecuted opponents, and established an authoritarian regime. The same Napoleon who brought the ideals of the French Revolution to Europe crowned himself emperor and waged a war of conquest that cost millions their lives. He was revolutionary and counter-revolutionary at the same time, liberator and oppressor, modernizer and tyrant. This ambivalence explains why the myth of Napoleon is still alive today. Even during his lifetime, admirers and opponents alike gathered around him. To his soldiers, he was an almost superhuman leader. For many intellectuals and poets of his time, Goethe, Hegel, Byron, he was a world spirit on horseback, a man who not only experienced history but made it. For his opponents, however, he was a demon, a usurper, a dangerous upstart who plunged Europe into chaos. His life reads like a novel. Born in 1769 on the remote island of Corsica, he rose from unknown artillery officer to celebrated general in just a few years. With bold campaigns in Italy and Egypt, he gained fame and prestige. With the coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire in 1799, he seized power in Paris and led France into a new era. In 1804, he put the imperial crown on himself, surrounded by splendor and rituals that were reminiscent of the old monarchy, but at the same time claimed the legitimacy of the revolution. His empire, the French Empire, soon expanded over almost all of Europe. From Madrid to Warsaw, from Naples to Hamburg, his laws and troops determined events. He overthrew old dynasties, installed relatives and confidants as kings, and shaped Europe according to his ideas. And yet, from the very beginning, his empire was a house of cards based on military superiority. When this began to falter, the empire also collapsed. The Russian campaign of 1812 marked the turning point. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest army in Europe, broke up in winter and in the vastness of the East. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the defeat at Waterloo in 1815, all this sealed his downfall. He was exiled twice, first to Elba, then to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. But even in defeat, the myth remained alive. On St. Helena, Napoleon dictated his memoirs, which were soon read throughout Europe and stylized him as a hero. For some, he was the martyr betrayed by the monarchies of Europe. For others, he was the tyrant whose overthrow brought freedom. His impact reached far beyond his life. In the 19th century, he became a symbolic figure for liberals, nationalists, and revolutionaries who saw in him the man who had challenged the old Europe. In France, his name remained inseparable from fame and greatness, so that even his nephew Louis Napoleon was later able to come to power as Napoleon III. Today, Napoleon is often viewed more soberly, as a child of his time, as a man who emerged from the French Revolution and spread its ideals throughout Europe, but at the same time perished in greed for power and war. Its contradictory nature makes it fascinating. He was neither a hero nor a villain, but a man who became the symbol of these upheavals in an era of upheavals. This script aims to present Napoleon's life and work in all its breadth, from his beginnings in Corsica to his campaigns and reforms to his downfall and posthumous fame. It shows how a single person was able to shape an era and why we still talk about him today when we think about power, history, and the course of the world. Chapter 2. Childhood in Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio in Corsica, an island that belonged to France but whose identity and culture were strongly influenced by Italy. Only a few months before his birth, France had taken Corsica from Genoa after long struggles in which the Corsicans had struggled for their independence. It was during this transitional period that Napoleon saw the light of day, and this tension between Corsican independence and French rule was to have a decisive influence on his early life. The Bonaparte family was noble but of modest position. She belonged to the lower landed gentry without great wealth or political influence. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and politically engaged. He had initially supported the Corsican independence movement, which was led by the charismatic freedom fighter Pasquale Paoli. But after France finally took control of the island, he sided with the new power to secure his family's chances of advancement. His wife, Letizia Ramolino, was a strict and religious woman who taught Napoleon discipline and thrift at an early age. She was to remain one of the most important caregivers in his life. Napoleon was the second of a total of 13 children, but only 8 of them reached adulthood. Even in his childhood, he stood out for his stubbornness and energy. He was small, slender, and characterized by a strong will. Contemporaries described him as a serious child who often preferred to read books or play alone rather than have fun with other children. The Corsican environment had a lasting impact on his worldview. The island was characterized by rugged nature, mountains, small villages, and proud traditions. The Corsicans lived in a climate of clan ties, concepts of honor, and deep mistrust of foreign rule. Napoleon soaked up this atmosphere. Even as a teenager, he admired Pasquale Paoli and saw him as a hero of independence. For a long time, he vacillated between his Corsican identity and his role as a French subject. The Bonapartes strove for social advancement, and the decisive step was taken through Carlo Bonaparte's connections. He won a royal scholarship for Napoleon, which enabled him to train in France. In 1779, at the age of only 10, the boy was sent to Brienne, to a military school intended for the lower nobility. It was a break in his life, from his Corsican homeland with its familiar traditions to a foreign, French environment where he initially felt like an outsider. In Brienne, Napoleon was often ridiculed for his Corsican accent and humble origins. He spoke French with a strong Italian touch and felt inferior to the sons of the rich aristocrats. But instead of despairing, he developed a defiant energy. He studied diligently, immersed himself in mathematics, history, and above all, military sciences. Early on, he showed a talent for strategy and a fascination for great generals of antiquity, such as Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. However, his childhood in Corsica remained a part of his identity. Even during his years of training, he passionately defended Corsican independence in discussions with his classmates. He wrote short texts and pamphlets in which he criticized French rule. While still a young officer, he wanted to return to Corsica to support Paoli's fight. Only later would he realize that his fate was not in the Corsican province, but in the center of France. His upbringing by his mother Letizia was formative. She raised her children to be strict and frugal, which Napoleon never completely abandoned later as emperor. Even in times of greatest power, he remained simple in some habits. He ate quickly and simply, he slept little, he did not like to waste money on luxury. This hardness of character was the foundation that allowed him to endure the rigors of military campaigns in the years to come. At the same time, he was shaped by the ambition of his father, who had risen in Corsican society by coming to terms with the new French power. Carlo died early, in 1785, leaving the family in modest circumstances.
For the young Napoleon, this was an incentive to take on responsibility himself and to support his family through his career. So his childhood in Corsica was marked by contrasts: pride and poverty, tradition and advancement, rebellion and adaptation. Napoleon grew up in a world that taught him distrust of authority, but at the same time awakened the ambition to exercise authority himself. In retrospect, it seems almost symbolic. A child born on an island between Italy and France, between freedom and foreign rule, was later to become the ruler of half of Europe. His Corsican roots have always remained part of his personality. Even as emperor, he spoke with a slight accent, and his direct, unvarnished manner reminded many of the gruff mentality of the Corsicans. But the island that shaped him was always more of a starting point than a goal for him. His gaze was set on greater things from an early age.
Chapter 3: Youth and Military Academy. When Napoleon Bonaparte came to France in 1779, he was only 10 years old. He entered a world that was initially foreign to him, a world that was clearly different from his Corsican homeland in language, culture, and mentality. But these years of youth and education were to be decisive. It was here that the young man who would later shape Europe as a general and politician was formed. His first stay took him to the military school of Brienne-le-Château, an institution for sons of the lower nobility. The Bonaparte family had secured this place through connections and scholarships, because although they were noble, they were anything but wealthy. Napoleon had to assert himself in an environment in which many classmates came from richer and more prestigious families. The first years in Brienne were tough. Napoleon spoke French with a strong Corsican accent and was often ridiculed for it. He was considered a loner who rarely integrated himself into the social games and rituals of his classmates. Instead, he withdrew into books and developed a remarkable zeal for learning. He was particularly fascinated by mathematics. Geometry, algebra, and the art of calculation sharpened his analytical mind. History also occupied a special place. He devoured works on the great generals of antiquity, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Caesar, and memorized their strategies. His classmates later remembered the small, slender boy who spoke with glowing seriousness of great battles and drew plans in the sand. Already in Brienne, Napoleon developed a passion for strategy and war games. He built fortresses out of snow and organized small campaigns with his comrades. In these games, he showed a talent for organization and leadership that impressed his teachers. But in addition to his intellectual strength, Napoleon also developed an unyielding will. He was proud and sensitive, did not let insults sit on him, and showed a tendency to rebellion. In discussions, he passionately defended Corsican independence and railed against French rule. In essays, he praised Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican freedom fighter, as a hero. This attitude made him an outsider, but also a figure who was perceived by teachers as indomitable. In 1784, at the age of 15, Napoleon transferred to the renowned military academy in Paris, the École Militaire. This was the beginning of a new phase of his life. The École was the highest training institution for officers, and Napoleon entered a world that was even more strongly influenced by the French aristocracy. Again, he had to assert himself, and again he did it through diligence and discipline. At the École, he concentrated particularly on artillery. At a time when cavalry and infantry dominated the battlefields, artillery was considered the weapon of the future. It demanded mathematical precision and technical understanding, exactly the qualities that Napoleon possessed. He studied the latest developments, wrote works on fortifications and the effect of guns. His performance was so excellent that he completed the training in just 1 year, instead of the usual 2 years. In 1785, at the age of only 16, he received his officer's commission as a lieutenant in the artillery. This was the beginning of his military career. He was transferred to Valence, a garrison town in southeastern France, where he first experienced the life of an officer. There, he not only deepened his knowledge of artillery, but also began to occupy himself more intensively with literature and philosophy. He read Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, but also novels and poems.
He was particularly impressed by Rousseau's idea of the social contract and popular sovereignty, ideas that he would later put into practice in his own way. But despite his intellectual curiosity and his officer's commission, Napoleon initially remained an outsider. He was young, of humble origins, and financially limited. While many of his comrades moved in officer circles and could afford social life, Napoleon lived modestly. He wrote letters home in which he told of his loneliness and longed for Corsica. His ties to Corsica remained strong. As late as the late 1780s, he planned to return there and support Paoli's cause. He saw himself as a Corsican who only received training in the French army in order to later fight for the freedom of his homeland. But these plans were soon to be shattered when the revolution broke out in France and offered Napoleon a new stage. The years at the military academies were therefore a phase of formation. It was here that Napoleon developed the discipline, analytical acuity, and self-confidence that later distinguished him. He learned to hold his own in hostile environments, and he internalized the knowledge he was to apply on the battlefields. At the same time, his ambition was consolidated. He didn't want to be just any officer, but someone who made history. Looking back, these years of youth revealed a person who was shaped by his background and education, but at the same time already bore the traits of what would later define him: tenacity, strategic thinking, pride, ambition, and the conviction that he was destined for a greater task.
Chapter 4. First Experiences as an Officer in the Revolutionary Era. When Napoleon joined the French army in 1785 at the age of just 16 as a young lieutenant in the artillery, the world was still relatively stable. France was a kingdom under Louis XVI, and although discontent among the population grew, no one suspected that in a few years a revolution would break out and shake the country. For Napoleon, this time marked the beginning of his military career, a career that would quickly lead him out of the anonymity of an unknown officer. His first stop was Valence, a garrison town on the banks of the Rhône. Here he lived modestly, in contrast to many officers, who were distinguished by social life, festivals, and contacts in high society. Napoleon, on the other hand, used his free time to read and write. He dealt with mathematics, history, and philosophy, but also with political questions. It was during this time that he wrote his first writings that revealed his world of thought: small treatises on government, freedom, and the future of Corsica. His heart was still closely connected to his homeland. In the 1780s, Napoleon saw himself first and foremost as a Corsican. He still revered Pasquale Paoli, the freedom fighter, and dreamed of one day seeing an independent Corsican republic. Again and again he traveled home, where he actively participated in the political debates of the island. Tensions between France and the Corsicans continued, and Napoleon wrote impassioned pamphlets against French rule. But while he argued for independence in Corsica, his relationship with France changed. The Revolution of 1789 turned everything upside down. Suddenly, ideas of freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty became central political issues. For Napoleon, this was initially a confirmation of his own ideas, which he had found in Rousseau's writings. He sympathized with the revolutionaries because they questioned the privileges of the nobility and the church, the very structures that disadvantaged him as a young officer from a modest family. During this time, he began to see himself more and more as part of the French nation. This did not mean that he gave up his Corsican identity, but he recognized that his future lay in revolutionary France. Paoli, on the other hand, increasingly turned against the revolution and sought the support of Great Britain. This led to a break between Napoleon and his former idol. From then on, he clearly sided with France, a turning point in his life. The first years of the revolution were difficult for the French army. Many officers from the high nobility left the country because they distrusted the changes or saw their lives threatened. This opened up opportunities for young, ambitious men like Napoleon. Suddenly, it was no longer origin alone that was decisive, but also talent. For someone like him, who excelled in knowledge, diligence, and determination, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Napoleon experienced his first real test in 1793 during the uprising of Toulon. The southern French port city was occupied by royalist forces and had allied itself with the British.
Control of Toulon was crucial, as the port was one of the most important bases of the Mediterranean fleet. Napoleon, then a young captain of the artillery, stood out in this siege. With a keen eye, he recognized the strategic importance of certain hills around the city. He proposed to build batteries there to fire at the port and force the British fleet to withdraw. His plan was accepted and he carried it out with great energy. The effect was resounding. In December 1793, Toulon capitulated, the Royalists were expelled, and the British had to withdraw. Napoleon suddenly became famous through this success. He was given the rank of brigadier general, an unusually quick promotion for such a young man. The victory of Toulon made him a man to rely on in the eyes of the revolutionary leadership. He had shown that he didn't just think theoretically, but found solutions in the field and knew how to enforce them. This success was also the beginning of his political rise. He was noticed in Paris, and the Jacobins, the dominant faction at the time, saw him as a capable and loyal officer. His name began to circulate in political circles, and although he himself was still young and inexperienced, he sensed that greater tasks lay ahead of him. But the path was not free of setbacks. After the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, 9th Thermidor, Napoleon also came under suspicion, because he had had close ties to the Jacobins. He was briefly arrested and removed from his position. Only with luck and through the intercession of influential friends did he escape a heavier punishment. This experience made it clear to him how uncertain the political situation was and how closely military success remained linked to the power struggles in Paris. Nevertheless, Napoleon had found his place by the mid-1790s. He was no longer just the Corsican outsider, but a French officer who had proven that he had strategic talent and unwavering will. Toulon was his first great springboard, which had lifted him out of the anonymous mass of officers. From here, his path led him to the great campaigns of Italy and to the European stage. The years of the Revolution had thus shaped Napoleon. They had given him the chance to get promoted, where there would hardly have been a place for him in the old system. They had turned him from a Corsican rebel into a French general, and they had shown that he was prepared not only to survive the turmoil of his time, but to use it for his own rise.
Chapter 5. The Italian Campaign, 1796-1797. When Napoleon took command of the Italian army of the French Republic in the spring of 1796, he was just 26 years old, a young general hardly known outside the inner military circles, but full of ambition. His appointment had been viewed with skepticism by some politicians in Paris. Was this slender, inconspicuous officer really capable of leading an army? But within a few months, he was not only to refute the doubts, but also to be imprinted in Europe's memory. The Italian campaign was Napoleon's first great triumph, a turning point that transformed him from an unknown general to a celebrated folk hero. The starting position was anything but favorable. The French-Italian army was poorly equipped, undersupplied, and of low morale. Many soldiers had not received pay for months, their uniforms had worn out, and supply lines were barely functioning. The opponents, on the other hand, Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, had better equipped troops at their disposal. It would have been obvious to behave defensively and wait for reinforcements from France, but Napoleon decided otherwise. Even in his first speeches to the troops, his talent for inspiring people was evident. "Soldiers, you are naked and half-starved. The government owes you a lot. It can't give you anything. I will lead you to the most fertile levels of the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." With these words, he roused the discouraged men from their lethargy and turned them into an army ready to fight for him. Napoleon's strategy was bold and unconventional. Instead of fighting the superiority of his opponents head-on, he relied on speed, surprise, and splitting up enemy armies. He realized that the Austrian and Piedmontese troops operated separately and were not closely coordinated. So he struck first at one, then at the other. In a series of rapid battles, including Montanate, Millesimo, and Mondovì, he defeated the Piedmontese army and forced the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont to sign an armistice in April 1796. This freed his back and allowed him to concentrate on the Austrians. His talent for combining politics and war was already evident here. With the Treaty of Cherasco, France gained not only territory, but also valuable resources for the rest of the campaign.
Against the Austrians, Napoleon led his men through the Alpine passes, often under the most adverse conditions. Battles such as those at Lodi in May 1796 made his reputation immortal. There, he personally stormed a bridge under heavy cannon fire, an act that made him an intrepid hero in the eyes of his soldiers. The hero of Lodi was born, and the myth of the young general who seemed invincible began to spread. His victories continued: Castiglione, Arcole, Rivoli, all names that went down in military history. Napoleon knew how to exploit his superior mobility and his feeling for his opponent's weaknesses. He maneuvered faster, struck unexpectedly, leaving his opponents little time to recover. For the Austrian generals, it was as if they were facing an opponent who was always one step ahead. But the Italian campaign was more than a series of military victories. Napoleon also showed political skill. In the conquered territories, he organized new sister republics that were built up according to the French model, such as the Cisalpine Republic. He presented himself not only as a conqueror, but as a liberator, who brought the ideals of freedom and equality to the peoples of Italy. Of course, this was also associated with the exploitation of the conquered countries. Works of art, money, and natural goods were sent to France to finance the war. Nevertheless, Napoleon spread the image of a new bringer of order in Italy. The campaigns took him to the gates of Vienna. In 1797, it was deep in Austrian territory, and the Habsburgs were forced to ask for peace. The Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797 was a diplomatic triumph for France and for Napoleon personally. Austria recognized French control over Belgium and northern Italy, while France ceded territories such as Venice to Austria. For the first time, Napoleon appeared as an independent negotiator, acting almost independently of the Paris government. The Italian campaign had far-reaching consequences. For France, it meant securing its southeastern borders and enormous financial gains. It was a shock to Europe. A young general, few had heard of before, had shaken the old order and demonstrated France's military superiority. For Napoleon himself, it was the beginning of his meteoric rise. From then on, he was no longer just an officer of the revolution, but a personality who helped determine the fate of the nation. The Italian campaign made Napoleon a folk hero. In Paris, he was celebrated as the savior of France. His portrait circulated, his deeds were praised in newspapers and pamphlets. For many French people, he was the man who had restored the glory and greatness of the fatherland. But the politicians of the board of directors also saw a danger in him. A general who possessed so much fame and influence could easily become a rival. Napoleon had thus not only founded his military career, but also laid the foundation for his political rise. Italy had been his touchstone, and he had passed it brilliantly.
Chapter 6: Egyptian Campaign and the Rise of the General. After the brilliant victories in Italy, Napoleon was the celebrated hero of France in 1797. His popularity soon outshone the authority of the Directory, the weak government that led the country after the Reign of Terror. For the politicians in Paris, he was indispensable on the one hand, but dangerous on the other. Such a popular general could easily become a rival, so they were looking for a way to involve him and keep him at a distance at the same time. The plan to put Napoleon at the head of an expedition to Egypt was the result of these considerations, and at the same time an expression of his own visions. The idea of moving to Egypt was not completely new. For a long time, the country on the Nile was considered the key to power in the Eastern Mediterranean and a way to threaten British influence in India. If France could gain a foothold there, it would deal a severe blow to the British Empire. At the same time, Egypt had an almost mythical reputation in Europe. It was the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and ancient knowledge. Napoleon himself was fascinated by the idea of leading a great expedition that would be not only militarily significant, but also scientifically and culturally. In May 1798, a huge fleet set sail from Toulon. It transported not only soldiers, but also scholars, engineers, and artists, a whole host of scientists who were to research and document ancient Egypt. This mixture of war and science was new and made the expedition a unique undertaking. The first stage was spectacular. Napoleon conquered the island of Malta, which until then had been ruled by the Order of Knights almost without resistance.
In July 1798, he finally landed at Alexandria. The march inland soon led him to the vicinity of the pyramids. On July 21, the famous Battle of the Pyramids took place, in which Napoleon had his troops formed in squares to repel the attacks of the Mameluke riders. With modern discipline and artillery, he defeated the numerically superior opponent. "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down on you," he is said to have said earlier, a sentence that is still considered an example of his ability to combine historical greatness with the moment. After this victory, Napoleon entered Cairo. He tried to present himself as a liberator who wanted to bring a more just order to the Egyptians. He issued proclamations respecting the Islamic religion and emphasizing that he had come to end oppression. But in reality, he remained a conqueror, and soon tensions and uprisings against the French occupation arose. The military success was also overshadowed by a serious accident. On 1 August 1798, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson attacked the French fleet in Abu Qir Bay. In the Battle of Abu Qir, almost the entire French fleet was destroyed. Napoleon was thus cut off from France and was stuck in Egypt with his troops. The dream of threatening Britain in the east was thus a distant prospect. Nevertheless, Napoleon tried to make the best of the situation. He organized expeditions to the country, had archaeological studies carried out, and thus founded modern Egyptology. The most famous find of that time was the Rosetta Stone, which would later provide the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. These scientific undertakings made the expedition a cultural event of great importance, despite military setbacks. Militarily, Napoleon turned to Syria to stabilize the situation. In 1799, he marched north with his army, but the campaign did not go as hoped. Above all, the siege of Acre became a fiasco. Illness, supply problems, and the fierce resistance of the defenders finally forced him to retreat. It was one of the rare defeats in his early career. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe deteriorated. The Directory was weak, France was under pressure from a new coalition of great powers. Napoleon realized that his future did not lie in distant Egypt, but in the center of power. In August 1799, he secretly left his army and sailed back to France, a risky step as the British fleet controlled the Mediterranean. But he managed to return, and when he arrived in Paris in October, he was received like a hero by the population. Although the Egyptian expedition was not a complete success militarily, Napoleon had not lost his fame. The victories at the pyramids, the scientific achievements, and the skillful propaganda had kept his image brilliantly in France. The defeats, especially at Abu Qir and Acre, were downplayed or attributed to the responsibility of others. For the public, he remained the victorious general who had achieved fame and honor in foreign countries. This cleared the way for the next step, entering politics. When he returned to Paris, he found a government that was weak and hated. The Directory struggled with internal conflicts, economic crisis, and military threats. Many French people longed for a strong man who could put things in order, and Napoleon was ready to take on this role.
Chapter 7: The 18th Brumaire, Coup d'état and Seizure of Power. When Napoleon returned to France from Egypt in October 1799, he found a nation in chaos. The Directory, the weak government that had led the country since 1795, was shattered. Corruption, intrigue, and inefficiency had destroyed their reputation. The economic situation was catastrophic. Inflation and supply crises shaped everyday life. At the same time, the French armies were under pressure because a second coalition of great powers, Austria, Russia, Great Britain, had formed against the Republic. In this climate of uncertainty, many French people longed for stability and strong leadership. At that very moment, Napoleon returned and seized the opportunity with both hands. His return was a triumph. The people received him enthusiastically, the newspapers celebrated him, and many politicians saw in him the man who could save France. Soon, together with influential allies, he began to make plans for a coup d'état. Among them was Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, a member of the Directory who had already become famous in 1789 with his essay, What is the Third Estate?
Sieyès himself had the intention of changing the constitution, but saw Napoleon as the decisive man to implement this plan. The coup d'état was scheduled for the 18th Brumaire of year 8 according to the revolutionary calendar, November 9, 1799. Napoleon played his part with great skill. Officially, it was only intended to protect the legislature from an alleged uprising. The councils, the Council of Elders and the Council of the 500, were moved from Paris to the castle of Saint-Cloud, ostensibly for security reasons. In reality, this was part of the plan to isolate them from the capital and put them under pressure. On the decisive day, Napoleon first appeared before the Council of Elders. There, he presented himself as the savior of the Republic. With pathetic words, he invoked the danger that threatened the nation and called for a new constitution. Many members of parliament were impressed, others suspicious. But Napoleon had the support of officers and troops stationed around the castle. His physical presence and the power of the military gave emphasis to his words. It became more difficult in the Council of the 500. Here he met with open resistance. When he entered the hall, a storm of indignation arose. Members of parliament shouted that he was a traitor, a usurper, and some are said to have even shouted, "Down with the dictator!" The mood threatened to tip over, and for a moment it seemed as if the plan could fail. Napoleon left the hall in shock, but his brother, Lucien, himself president of the council, intervened. With a mixture of rhetoric and determination, he portrayed the deputies as a threat to the Republic and appealed to the soldiers outside to do their duty. The military decided the situation. Grenadiers stormed the hall and evacuated it by force. This broke the resistance. That same evening, the Directory was deposed and power was transferred to 3 consuls, Napoleon, Sieyès, and Ducos. But it was clear from the beginning who held the real authority. Napoleon was the strong man on whom everything was concentrated. With the 18th Brumaire, the time of the Directory ended, and the consulate began. Many historians see this day as the end of the French Revolution in the narrower sense. Although France formally remained a republic, in reality, a military leader had taken power and disempowered democratic institutions. The coup d'état was not only a political maneuver, but also a masterpiece of staging. Napoleon knew how to present himself as both a savior and a necessary authority. He emphasized that he had not come to destroy freedom, but to save it. Many French people believed him because they were tired of chaos, insecurity, and corruption. They longed for order, and Napoleon promised to bring them. The success of the coup d'état was based on several factors. First, the board was deeply unpopular, so few were willing to defend it. Second, Napoleon had the support of the military, who trusted and admired him. Third, he was a master at turning situations to his advantage, even when they threatened to fail, as in the Council of the 500. In the weeks after the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon consolidated his position. The new constitution of year 8 was drafted and came into force in December 1799. It created the consulate, but in reality, it was a constitution on Napoleon's scale. As first consul, he was given almost unlimited executive power. He appointed ministers, controlled the administration, and had great influence on legislation. Sieyès, who had initially seen himself as a pioneer, was soon marginalized. Napoleon had thus taken the decisive step. The young general, who had gained fame in Italy and Egypt, had become the political leader of France. He had left the revolution behind without abandoning its achievements and, at the same time, ushered in a new era. The people saw in him the man who would bring order, and history was to show that he had much more in mind.
Chapter 8. The Consulate. Order after the Revolution. With the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon Bonaparte had taken power. But a coup d'état alone is not enough to stay at the top permanently. What followed was a phase of consolidation, the period of the Consulate, which lasted from 1799 to 1804. During these years, Napoleon transformed the weak, unstable republic into a centralized and capable state. He presented himself as the savior of the revolution, as a man of order and progress, and at the same time paved the way for his later coronation as emperor. The Constitution of Year 8, which came into force in December 1799, was outwardly republican,
but in reality, a tool to secure Napoleon's power. There were 3 consuls at the top, but the first consul, Napoleon, had almost unlimited executive power. He appointed ministers, appointed certain officials, controlled legislation on the state council system, and exercised great influence over the army. The other 2 consuls, Sieyès and Ducos, soon played hardly any role. From the very beginning, Napoleon knew how to create legitimacy. He had the constitution confirmed by a plebiscite, a referendum that officially resulted in an overwhelming yes. Even though the result came about through pressure and manipulation, it gave the impression that the nation was behind him. In doing so, he tied in with the revolution, which had acted in the name of the people and, at the same time, gave his rule a republican veneer. His first priority was to restore order. France was a shattered country in 1799. After years of revolution and the Directorate, the administration was inefficient, the judiciary weak, and the finances desolate. Napoleon tackled all this with determination. He centralized the administration by appointing a prefect in each department, appointed directly by the government and acting as an extended arm of the state. This put an end to the old diversity of local centers of power. France became a unified state. The judiciary was also given a new structure. Napoleon strove for a clear, uniform legal system that was no longer characterized by regional differences. The culmination of these reforms was the Code Civil, which will be discussed in more detail later. Already in the consulate, however, he laid the foundation for a legal system that permanently secured the achievements of the revolution, such as equality before the law and the abolition of feudal privileges. He stabilized the finances by founding the Banque de France in 1800. This institution was supposed to consolidate the currency and secure the national budget. Taxes were levied more fairly and efficiently, and corruption was combated. Within a short time, Napoleon succeeded in restoring confidence in the French economy. But order did not only mean administration and finances. Napoleon also sought a balance in domestic politics. He knew that France was divided by deep rifts: revolutionaries against royalists, Jacobins against moderates, believers against anti-clerical forces. His policy was pragmatic. He tried to involve opponents instead of continuing to fight them. Many royalists in exile were given the opportunity to return if they behaved loyally. Jacobins who were willing to cooperate with the new government could receive posts. In doing so, he created a climate of relative reconciliation. His attitude towards the church was particularly significant. After the fierce conflicts of the revolutionary period, Napoleon realized that reconciliation was necessary. Although the church remained under state control, it opened up the space for religious practice. This was finally to culminate in 1801 in the Concordat with the Pope, which will be dealt with in more detail in the next chapter. Even in the consulate, however, it became apparent that Napoleon did not want to appear as an enemy of religion, but as its pragmatic leader. He also set a new course militarily. The armies of France had won victories under the Directorate, but they were exhausted and in some areas disorganized. Napoleon himself took command in Italy and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in 1800. This victory strengthened not only his military, but also his political authority. He now finally appeared as the man who not only ruled France, but also defended it. The years of the consulate were thus marked by a remarkable double strategy. Napoleon secured the achievements of the revolution: equality before the law, abolition of feudal rights, recognition of talents regardless of birth, and combined them with a tight, centralized order. Freedom and political co-determination, on the other hand, receded into the background. The press was restricted, opposition newspapers were banned, and the elections were more staging than reality. But for most French people, the gain in stability outweighed the loss of political freedoms. Napoleon also knew how to present himself as a symbol of a new era. He had paintings and engravings distributed that showed him as a man of the people, but also as a leader. His speeches were full of references to the revolution, but at the same time, he presented himself as the one who had ended its excesses. He was not the bloody Jacobin, but the regulating statesman. By 1802, he had consolidated his position of power to such an extent that he was appointed consul for life by another plebiscite. Again, the result was overwhelming, and again, hardly anyone doubted that it was steered. But it showed that Napoleon cleverly legitimized his rule as an expression of the will of the people. The consulate was thus not only a transitional phase, but a decisive step. Napoleon transformed the Republic into a state capable of acting, created the foundations of modern administration and jurisdiction, and won the trust of the population. At the same time, he eliminated political freedoms and made it clear that his rule was based on authority. For France, these years meant stability after a decade of turmoil. For Napoleon, they were the stage on which he developed from general to statesman. Soon he was to take the next step, the coronation as emperor, which would finally seal his power.
Chapter 9. The Code Civil, Napoleon's Code of Law. If one is looking for an achievement that secured Napoleon's legacy beyond his military victories, it is undoubtedly the Code Civil. This code, which came into force in 1804, is considered one of the greatest milestones in legal history. It not only outlasted the German Empire, but has shaped large parts of Europe and the world to this day. While his armies were defeated and his empire fell apart, the code remained as a foundation, a symbol of the enduring side of his rule. The idea of a uniform code of law was not new. As early as the French Revolution, the desire had been expressed to replace the multitude of regional legal systems and the complicated remnants of feudal law with a modern, general legal system. But the turmoil of the Revolution had prevented it from being implemented. Napoleon took up this concern and made it one of his central projects in the consulate. The mandate was clear. France was to have a single, uniform code of law that applied to all citizens, regardless of origin, status, or region. This was to finally make equality before the law, which had been a central principle since 1789, a reality. At the same time, Napoleon wanted to create a system that was simple, clear, and applicable in practice. He appointed a commission of lawyers led by Jean-Étienne Marie Portalis, an experienced lawyer, to draw up the work. Under Napoleon's watchful supervision, the code was drafted in an astonishingly short time. Napoleon himself took an active part in the discussions. Again and again, he took part in meetings, asked questions, decided on controversial issues. His pragmatic spirit was also evident here. He did not want a complicated theory, but a law that works in everyday life. What is clear is good, what is unclear is bad, he is said to have said. The Code Civil was clearly structured in its structure. It consisted of three main ledgers: the law of persons, the law of property, and the law of obligations. Each book dealt with central areas of bourgeois life: marriage and family, property and possessions, contracts and obligations. Property rights were particularly important. The code guaranteed the unrestricted right to property, making it an inviolable foundation of society. This finally broke with the feudal taxes and obligations of the old days. Every citizen could acquire, use, and bequeath property, a central achievement that also meant enormous economic progress. Equality before the law was also enshrined. Noble privileges, as they had existed in the Ancien regime, were finally abolished. In court, everyone was now considered equal, regardless of their birth. Careers were no longer to depend on status, but on talent and performance, a principle embodied by Napoleon himself. But the Code Civil was not progressive in all areas. A conservative trait was particularly evident in family law. Marriage was defined as an institution dominated by the man. Women were legally patronized, had limited opportunities to dispose of property, and were in many respects subject to the authority of their husbands. Illegitimate children were also disadvantaged. This reflected Napoleon's own patriarchal worldview, which stood in the way of modern equality. Nevertheless, the importance of the code was enormous. It brought a clarity and uniformity that France had urgently needed. Before its introduction, there was a patchwork of local legal systems. In northern France, different laws applied than in the south, and in some regions, medieval customary laws still existed. With the Code Civil, there was now a uniform law for all French people. The effect of the code was not limited to France. In all the territories conquered by Napoleon, Italy, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Poland, it was introduced or served as a model. Even after the fall of Napoleon, it remained in place in many places because it was more practical and modern than the old legal systems. To this day, its principles form the basis of many civil law systems in Europe, Latin America, and even parts of Africa and Asia. Napoleon himself was aware of the importance. Later he is said to have said, "My true glory is not the Battle of Austerlitz. What will take forever is my Code Civil." This statement shows that he understood his role not only as a general but also as a legislator.
In fact, the code was a work that changed the everyday lives of millions of people, far more than a military battle ever could. Of course, the code also had critics. Some revolutionaries saw it as a betrayal of egalitarian ideals because it discriminated against women and placed the authority of the family above individual freedom. Others accused Napoleon of being too much of an instrument of his power, as it consolidated the state and its order. But what was undeniable was that the code brought order and stability, exactly what people longed for after years of turmoil. In the further course of his reign, Napoleon was to supplement the Code Civil with accompanying works, the Code de procédure civile, the Code de commerce, and the Code pénal. Together, they formed a comprehensive legal system that led France into the modern age. The Code Civil is still alive today. In France, it has been reformed and adapted over the centuries, but its core remains. Terms such as property, contract, and civil rights have their roots in this work. It is one of Napoleon's most enduring legacies, a code of laws that tells more about him than many a victory on the battlefield.
Chapter 10. Napoleon as a Reformer. Administration, Education, Economy. Napoleon is often seen primarily as a general, but his real greatness also lay in his ability to organize and modernize the state. While his armies covered Europe, he created a foundation inside France that lasted beyond his time. Administration, education, and the economy were the three pillars on which he built a new France: efficient, centralized, and focused on performance. After years of revolution, the country was exhausted. The political experiments had destroyed old structures, but had not created a stable order. The board of directors had been characterized by corruption and inefficiency, and the population longed for clear structures. Napoleon understood this mood and did everything in his power to restore order. Administration, centralization, and control. For Napoleon, administration was the backbone of the state. Already in the consulate, he introduced a reform that permanently changed France. Instead of the local diversity, which still came from the time before the revolution, he established a strictly hierarchical structure. A prefect was appointed in each department, who was appointed directly by the government. These prefects were not elected representatives, but civil servants who enforced the interests of the state. Sub-prefects, mayors, and municipal councilors worked below the prefects, all under state control. This meant that the administration was centralized in a way that had not been the case before. France became a uniformly controlled state in which local peculiarities could exist, but no longer had any influence on the basic order. For Napoleon, this structure was not only an instrument of efficiency, but also of political control. The prefects were his eyes and ears in the provinces. They monitored the implementation of its laws, reported riots, and ensured that taxes were collected and soldiers were recruited. With this administration, he created a system that functioned long beyond his time, basically the basis of modern French administration, which remained almost unchanged until the 20th century. Education, schools for the state. Education was just as important to Napoleon. He was convinced that the state could only be strong if it formed its citizens and aligned them with the needs of society. Education should not only serve individual development, but also the nation. He founded the so-called lycées, state secondary schools that were intended to prepare young men for a career in administration, the military, or science. These schools were under strict state supervision and placed great emphasis on discipline, mathematics, science, and classical education. This created a uniform school system that differed significantly from the old church-run schools. Particularly characteristic was the emphasis on performance. The best students received scholarships, regardless of their origin or status. Talent and diligence were to decide, a principle embodied by Napoleon himself and which opened up opportunities for advancement for many young Frenchmen. The universities were also reformed. Napoleon founded the Université Impériale, a central institution that coordinated the entire education system. In doing so, he subordinated education to the state and made it a tool of his politics. Economy, stability, and promotion. After the turmoil of the Revolution, the French economy was in poor shape. Inflation, currency crises, and uncertain property relations had shaken confidence.
Napoleon realized that economic stability was necessary to consolidate his rule. As early as 1800, he founded the Banque de France. This institution was supposed to stabilize the currency, organize loans, and order the financial system. With the Banque de France, he created a central instrument that benefited both the state and the economy. He also introduced reforms in the tax system. Taxes were distributed more evenly, and collection was made more efficient. Corruption and mismanagement, which had been widespread under the Directorate, were combated. The state thus received regular revenues that financed his reforms and wars. In addition, Napoleon promoted infrastructure projects. Roads and bridges were built, canals improved, trade facilitated. These investments strengthened the economy and improved the mobility of the army at the same time, an example of how Napoleon always combined several goals: social order, security, and control. Another important area was public safety. Napoleon reorganized the police and created a close-knit network of officers who both fought crime and monitored political opposition. For him, inner peace was a prerequisite for progress. At the same time, he focused on the creation of a new elite. Noble privileges were abolished, but Napoleon introduced a new title nobility, no longer by birth, but by performance. Generals, civil servants, and scholars could be ennobled if they had earned merit. In this way, he combined the tradition of rank and honor with the principles of the Revolution. Assessment of the reforms. In administration, education, and business, Napoleon's genius showed himself to be an organizer. He knew how to combine revolutionary principles, equality before the law, advancement through talent, with strict order. The result was a state that was more modern, efficient, and stable than ever before. Of course, this order also had its price. Freedom and co-determination were severely restricted. The press was controlled. Education served the state more than the individual. The administration was hierarchical and not very democratic. But for many French people, the gain in stability outweighed the gains after the chaotic years of the Revolution. These reforms made France a model of modern statehood. Many of the structures that Napoleon created outlasted his empire and continue to shape France today. While his military conquests were eventually lost, his work as a reformer remained, perhaps the most enduring legacy he left behind.
Chapter 11: The Concordat, a new relationship to the Church. Among the many conflicts triggered by the French Revolution, none was as profound as the one between state and church. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been a mainstay of the Ancien regime. It owned land, enjoyed privileges, and shaped the intellectual life of the nation. With the Revolution, this changed abruptly. In 1789, the properties of the church were nationalized, and in 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy forced the clergy to take an oath to the nation. Many priests refused, and a deep division arose between oath-takers and oath-refusing clergy, between those who subordinated themselves to the Revolution and those who clung to the traditional church. Under the Terror, the situation had escalated. Churches were closed, church services were banned, the cult of reason was introduced. Religion was portrayed as the enemy of freedom, and countless priests were persecuted to the furthest corners of the country. When Napoleon took power in 1799, this conflict had not yet been overcome. In many regions, especially in the Vendée and Brittany, there was a deep mistrust of the Republic. The break with the Church was one of the causes of the civil wars that shook France. Napoleon realized that reconciliation was necessary if he wanted to pacify the country. He was not a particularly religious person, but pragmatic. For him, religion was first and foremost an instrument of social order. A society without religion is like a ship without a compass, he is said to have said. What he was striving for was not a return to the power of the old church, but a controlled interaction of state and faith. In 1801, he began negotiations with Pope Pius VII. It was a delicate undertaking because both sides had to make concessions. The Pope wanted to secure the rights of the Church. Napoleon, on the other hand, wanted to keep the upper hand and not give up the achievements of the Revolution. After long talks, the Concordat of Paris was signed in July 1801, which came into force at the beginning of 1802. The Concordat officially established the Catholic Church as the religion of the majority of the French.
In doing so, the state recognized its central role in religious life, but without elevating it to the status of state religion. At the same time, the Pope accepted that the church property nationalized during the Revolution would not be returned. This secured the new ownership structure, a crucial point for maintaining social peace. In the future, the bishops were proposed by the state and confirmed by the Pope. In this way, the church remained integrated into the state system without completely losing its connection to Rome. Priests received a state salary, but had to take an oath of allegiance to the government. This meant that the church was materially secure, but at the same time dependent on the state. For Napoleon, the Concordat was a political masterstroke. He had reintegrated the Catholic Church into public life, diffused the tensions in the provinces, and still retained control. Religion became the pillar of his rule, not a competition. The Pope had formal influence, but the real power lay with Napoleon and his administrative apparatus. The reactions to the Concordat were mixed. Many believers welcomed it because they were finally able to openly practice their faith again. Churches were reopened, festivals were celebrated, religious life flourished again. In rural areas, where the church has always been deeply rooted, this was a step towards normality. But among radical revolutionaries and former Jacobins, reconciliation with Rome aroused mistrust. They saw this as a betrayal of the principles of the Enlightenment and revolutionary freedom. Napoleon, however, cared little about this criticism. What counted for him was that he had pacified the country and stabilized his power. The relationship with the church remained a sensitive issue in the following years. Napoleon used it cleverly to further strengthen his position. When he was crowned emperor in 1804, he invited Pope Pius VII to Paris. The coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral became a powerful symbol. The Pope was present, but Napoleon put the crown on himself. In doing so, he demonstrated that his power was not bestowed by the Pope, but by himself and, as he presented it, by the people. It was an impressive picture that underlined his authority over church and state alike. In practice, the relationship remained ambivalent. On the one hand, Napoleon adhered to the Concordat and used the church as a partner. On the other hand, he showed again and again that he did not accept any restriction of his power. When the Pope opposed the Continental blockade and Napoleon's policy in Italy, the alliance began to falter. Finally, Napoleon even had the Pope captured and brought to France. This showed how much he understood religion as an instrument that he had to direct, not the other way around. Nevertheless, the Concordat remains a turning point. It was the moment when Napoleon brought France a reconciliation with religion without abandoning the principles of the Revolution. The church regained its dignity, but it was integrated into a state system that made it dependent on the favor of the ruler. In doing so, Napoleon succeeded in doing what no one before him had achieved. He created a balance between tradition and modernity, between faith and statehood. The Concordat outlasted Napoleon himself. It remained in force until 1905, when the strict separation of church and state was introduced in France. This made it one of the longest-lived results of his policy. For Napoleon, it was further proof of his ability to diffuse political and social conflicts through pragmatic solutions, not out of idealism, but out of the pursuit of order and power.
Chapter 12. The Emperor's Coronation, 1804. In 1804, Napoleon's rise reached a climax that would forever shape his image in history: the coronation as Emperor of the French. Only a few years earlier, he had been a young general who had gained fame through his victories in Italy and Egypt. Now, in a staging full of symbolism and political sophistication, he rose above the revolution and presented himself as the heir, but at the same time as the accomplisher of these upheavals. The imperial coronation was not just a ceremonial act, but a message to France and Europe, a message that Napoleon had come to establish a new dynasty and a new order. Even the preparation for this step was characterized by calculation. Napoleon knew that his power had long since exceeded what a consulate formally allowed. As first consul for life, he had almost unlimited powers. But he aspired to something more permanent, a form of rule that would last beyond his own life. A republican consulate was too unsafe, too tied to his person. An empire, on the other hand, promised continuity and the possibility of founding a dynasty. In doing so, he combined the achievements of the revolution, advancement through performance, equality before the law, with the stability of monarchical tradition.
In order to legitimize his coronation, he once again let the people speak. In a plebiscite, an overwhelming majority voted for the introduction of the empire. Even though the vote was heavily influenced, Napoleon could invoke the nation's vote. This distinguished him from the kings of the Ancien regime, who derived their legitimacy from divine right. Napoleon presented himself as the emperor of the French, not as a king by the grace of God, but as a ruler in the name of the people. The coronation took place on 2 December 1804 in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Even the choice of location was symbolic. Not the old coronation cathedral of Rennes, where the Bourbon kings had been anointed, but the capital itself, the heart of the revolution, was to be the scene of the event. Napoleon thus united the new and the old, the tradition of sacred consecration with the spirit of the modern nation. Pope Pius VII had come especially from Rome, a sign of enormous importance. For the first time in centuries, a pope attended the coronation of a French ruler. Thus, the blessing of the church was to lie over the new rule. But Napoleon made sure that he determined the symbolism himself. At the moment when the pope was about to put the crown on his head, Napoleon himself reached for it and put it on with his own hands. With this gesture, he made it unmistakably clear: his power did not come from the pope, not from God, but from himself, and ultimately from the people who had confirmed him through the plebiscite. The coronation ceremony was an unparalleled spectacle. In magnificent robes, with ermine cloak and gold-embroidered regalia, Napoleon presented himself as a ruler in the splendor of the monarchy. His wife Josephine was crowned empress, also by his own hand. Musicians, poets, and painters captured the moment, especially Jacques-Louis David, whose famous painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, makes the event iconic to this day. But the coronation was more than a magnificent ritual. It was a signal to Europe. Napoleon wanted to show that he was not just a revolutionary general, but a ruler of the same rank as the crowned heads of the old dynasties. He demanded recognition as an equal partner or rival of the Habsburgs, Hohenzollerns, and Romanovs. At the same time, he wanted to make it clear to the French that the time of political uncertainty was over. With him, a new era began that promised stability and greatness. The reactions were different. Many French welcomed the step because they saw Napoleon as the guarantor of order. After years of revolution and terror, the need for stability was great. Others, on the other hand, saw the empire as a betrayal of the ideals of 1789. They accused him of abolishing the republic and establishing a new monarchy. But Napoleon knew how to combine both points of view. He presented his empire as a continuation of the revolution, only in an orderly form. Europe reacted with skepticism, even fear. The powers of the continent had already seen Napoleon as a dangerous upstart, but as emperor, he became an even greater threat. Monarchs feared that his rule would spread the revolutionary spirit further, and that his ambitions would not end at the borders of France. And indeed, as soon as the coronation was completed, Napoleon began to expand his empire over the whole of Europe. The imperial coronation of 1804 was therefore a turning point. It marked the end of the Revolutionary Republic and the beginning of the Napoleonic Empire. It was a break with the past and, at the same time, its continuation. Napoleon had adopted the symbols of the monarchy, but charged them with the ideas of the revolution. He was not a king by the grace of God, but an emperor who claimed his own power. This image stuck. Long after his fall, the scene in Notre Dame was remembered, the moment when he put the crown on himself. For some, it was the expression of an indomitable will, for others, the sign of boundless hubris. In any case, it was the moment when Napoleon finally staged himself as one of the most powerful men in Europe and as a ruler determined to shape not only France, but history itself.
Chapter 13: Europe under Napoleon, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. With his coronation as Emperor of the French in December 1804, Napoleon had ushered in a new era. But the crown alone did not make him untouchable. In Europe, a broad front of monarchies immediately formed that did not want to recognize his power. Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and later Prussia saw him not only as an upstart, but also as an existential threat to the old European balance. Napoleon, on the other hand, knew that his empire could only survive if he put his opponents in their place militarily.
In the years that followed, he led France to a series of victories that brought his prestige to the peak and secured him the reputation of the greatest general of his time. The first major test came in 1805, when Great Britain had been looking for every way to weaken France for years. Napoleon planned an invasion of the island, but the plan finally failed when Admiral Nelson destroyed the Franco-Spanish fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar. Great Britain remained invincible at sea. But Napoleon shifted the theater of war to the mainland and turned against Austria and Russia, which had formed the so-called Third Coalition together with Great Britain. In the autumn of 1805, Napoleon marched south at breathtaking speed. His Grande Armée, which had actually been prepared for the invasion of England in Boulogne, moved over hundreds of kilometers in a few weeks and surprised the Austrians near Ulm. There, an entire Austrian army capitulated before it could unite with the Russian allies. The way to Vienna was clear, and Napoleon triumphantly entered the capital of the Habsburgs. But the highlight of this campaign was the Battle of Austerlitz on 2 December 1805, which later went down in history as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia and Austria with about 73,000 men, which numbered about 85,000 soldiers. He feigned weakness, left part of his position seemingly unprotected, and lured his opponents into the trap. When they attacked, his troops stormed the strategically crucial Pau Plateau and smashed enemy lines. In the end, it was a brilliant victory. The coalition army was defeated, and the Treaty of Pressburg confirmed Napoleon's dominance in Central Europe. For his soldiers, Austerlitz was proof that their emperor was invincible. It was a shock for Europe because the old power structure seemed to have collapsed for good. But the opponents did not give up. As early as 1806, a new coalition was formed, this time with Prussia at the head. Prussia, which had been considered a major military power since the 18th century, had hesitated for a long time. But in view of Napoleon's growing influence in Germany, it felt compelled to act. The war was catastrophic for the Prussians. In the double battle of Jena and Auerstedt on 14 October 1806, their armies were devastatingly defeated. Napoleon himself won at Jena, while his Marshal Davout put a much larger Prussian army to flight at Auerstedt with only 27,000 men. The defeat was a disaster for Prussia. Within a few weeks, the French occupied large parts of the country. Napoleon moved into Berlin and from there decreed the so-called Continental Blockade, which was intended to prevent trade with Great Britain. For many contemporaries, it was unimaginable. Proud Prussia, once heir to Frederick the Great, had been wrestled down by Napoleon's troops in a few days. The war continued because Russia remained steadfast. In 1807, there was the bloody Battle of Eylau, which was not a clear victory, but made the horrors of war particularly clear. But a few months later, in June 1807, Napoleon achieved a decisive triumph over the Russians at Friedland. Tsar Alexander I was forced to make peace. The two rulers met in Tilsit and concluded an agreement that reorganized Europe. Prussia was reduced to a rump state. Russia allied itself with France, and Napoleon was at the height of his power. But the fight for Europe continued. In 1809, Austria started the war again. This time, the situation was more difficult because French resources were heavily strained by the war in Spain and the Continental Blockade. Nevertheless, Napoleon managed to beat his opponents again. After initial setbacks at Aspern-Essling, where he suffered his first major defeat, he gathered his strength and won a decisive victory at Wagram in July 1809. The Austrian army was defeated, and in the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the Habsburg Empire again had to accept considerable territorial losses. The battles of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram made Napoleon the undisputed ruler of mainland Europe. His military brilliance consisted in taking opponents by surprise with speed, surprise, and skillful deception. He knew how to maneuver armies as if they were pieces on a chessboard, and his opponents rarely found an answer to his dynamics. But the price of these victories was high. Millions of soldiers fought and suffered, entire countries were occupied, and the political order of Europe was overturned again and again. While Napoleon consolidated his power, resistance grew at the same time. Oppressed peoples began to rebel against French rule, and the old monarchies did not give up their ambitions. For the moment, however, Napoleon was undisputedly the master of Europe. His victories had changed the map, humiliated old dynasties, and created new states. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. Italy was largely under his control, and even Spain had fallen under his grip,
even if bitter resistance was soon to break out there. Europe was under the sign of the Emperor of the French, whose fame had been forged on the battlefields of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram.
Chapter 14: Napoleon and Germany, Confederation of the Rhine, and Reforms. While Napoleon consolidated the empire in France and celebrated his military triumphs in Italy and Austria, he increasingly looked at fragmented Germany. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire was a complicated structure of hundreds of principalities, dioceses, and free cities. Formally, the emperor was at the top in Vienna, but in practice, the empire was a patchwork quilt without uniform leadership. For Napoleon, this fragmentation offered an opportunity. He could destroy the old order and replace it with a structure that would secure France's influence in Central Europe. The decisive turning point came after the victory of Austerlitz in 1805 and the subsequent Peace of Pressburg. Austria had suffered a heavy defeat, and Napoleon used the moment to change the balance of power in Germany. In 1806, the Confederation of the Rhine was founded, an association of initially 16 German states under the protectorate of Napoleon. Soon, other principalities joined, so that the League eventually comprised over 30 members. This sealed the end of the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor Franz II resigned the imperial crown in August 1806, and henceforth called himself Franz I, Emperor of Austria. An institution that had existed since the Middle Ages had been finally wiped out by Napoleon. The Confederation of the Rhine was more than just a political reorganization. For Napoleon, it was a military instrument. The member states committed themselves to providing troops for his campaigns. From then on, German soldiers fought in Spain, Russia, and on numerous battlefields in Europe, often not out of their own interest, but because their princes were beholden to the French emperor. At the same time, the princes who joined Napoleon received new territories and titles. Small dominions were dissolved, larger states emerged. Bavaria and Württemberg were elevated to kingdoms, Baden to the Grand Duchy. Napoleon rewarded loyalty with power, creating a new political map. But his interventions also had profound consequences for society. With the mediatization and secularization, numerous small principalities and ecclesiastical territories disappeared. The church lost its political influence, and many old structures dissolved. For the people, this meant a fundamental change in their living environment. Sometimes it brought advantages because administration and the judiciary were standardized. Often, however, it also meant that local traditions disappeared, and the new rule was imposed from outside. Napoleon knew how to transfer the reforms he had introduced in France to the German states. The Code Civil, the Napoleonic Code, was introduced in many states of the Confederation of the Rhine and replaced the complicated legal systems of the past. This gave citizens a unified legal system that guaranteed property, emphasized equality before the law, and abolished feudal privileges. For many, this was progress that brought new freedoms and legal certainty. At the same time, however, it also strengthened the state's control over daily life. Napoleon's influence also had an impact on administration and education. The newly created states were based on the centralized model of France. Civil servants were selected on merit, not birth, and modern structures replaced the old, often chaotic systems in many places. Schools were reformed, universities were given new content, and the idea of achievement and talent gained in importance. Thus, the Confederation of the Rhine became a laboratory of modernity for many German territories. But these reforms went hand in hand with the experience of foreign rule. For many Germans, Napoleon was not a liberator but an occupier. His troops moved through the country. His taxes and recruitment weighed heavily on the population. In particular, the obligation to provide soldiers for the French armies was unpopular. Many families saw their sons die in wars that were not theirs. At the same time, the Continental Blockade, which was intended to prevent trade with Great Britain, brought economic difficulties. The shortage of British goods and the suppression of maritime trade hit the merchants in Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck hard. Over time, the resistance grew. Although the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine benefited from Napoleon's favor, resentment developed among the population. Poets, philosophers, and intellectuals began to think about the German nation, an idea that had previously hardly existed in a patchwork of principalities. The experience of foreign rule became a motor for the German national idea.
Works by Ernst Moritz Arndt and Johann Gottlieb Fichte, which called for unity and self-determination, were disseminated. In doing so, Napoleon's rule inadvertently laid the foundation for the later wars of liberation. He also met with military resistance. In 1809, when Austria fought against France, a popular uprising arose in Tyrol under Andreas Hofer. The Tyroleans fought with all their might against the incorporation into Napoleonic Bavaria and fought for their old affiliation to Austria. Although the uprising was crushed, it remained a symbol of resistance against Napoleon in the German lands. The years of the Confederation of the Rhine showed the ambiguity of Napoleon's work in Germany. On the one hand, it brought reforms that destroyed feudal structures and introduced modern administration. On the other hand, he embodied foreign rule, coercion, and exploitation. His interventions created new kingdoms and duchies, changed the political map, and turned the old empire history. At the same time, he inadvertently promoted the idea of a German nation that was soon to turn against him. He also met with military resistance. In 1809, when Austria fought against France, a popular uprising arose in Tyrol under Andreas Hofer. The Tyroleans fought with all their might against the incorporation into Napoleonic Bavaria and fought for their old affiliation to Austria. Although the uprising was crushed, it remained a symbol of resistance against Napoleon in the German lands. The years of the Confederation of the Rhine showed the ambiguity of Napoleon's work in Germany. On the one hand, it brought reforms that destroyed feudal structures and introduced modern administration. On the other hand, he embodied foreign rule, coercion, and exploitation. His interventions created new kingdoms and duchies, changed the political map, and turned the old empire history. At the same time, he inadvertently promoted the idea of a German nation that was soon to turn against him. When Napoleon was weakened in 1813 after the catastrophe of the Russian campaign, many Rhine Confederation states turned their backs on him. Bavaria and others changed sides and joined the coalition against France. This broke the structure he had created in 1806. But the traces remained. The old small states had disappeared, new structures had been established. In many ways, Napoleon paved the way for what would later become Germany, even though he himself never intended to create a German nation. So his work in Germany remains a double legacy. He was both a destroyer and a modernizer, an occupier and a reformer. The Confederation of the Rhine was an expression of his power over Central Europe, but also a catalyst for developments that ultimately contributed to its overthrow. Under him, Germany experienced the harshness of foreign rule, and at the same time discovered the idea of its own unity.
Chapter 15: Spain and the Guerrilla War. While Napoleon celebrated victories in the heart of Europe and reshaped states according to his will, a battlefield opened up in the West that was to prove to be one of his greatest mistakes and, at the same time, an endless death toll: Spain. What at first appeared to be a side front developed into a wound that weakened him for years and tied up valuable forces. The Spanish War was not only a military struggle, but also an uprising of a people against a foreign ruler, and it gave rise to a new type of war, guerrilla warfare. The background lay in Napoleon's attempt to fully enforce the continental blockade against Great Britain. Since Portugal did not prevent trade with the British, he ordered the invasion of French troops into Portugal in 1807. To get there, they marched through Spain, which was formally an ally of France. But the situation in Spain was unstable. King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand were in fierce conflict, and the population was dissatisfied with a weak monarchy. Napoleon used this crisis to his advantage. In 1808, he forced both Bourbons to abdicate the throne and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain instead. This intervention in the Spanish dynasty caused outrage. For many Spaniards, it was an outrageous act that a foreign Frenchman should rule their country. The appointment of Joseph Bonaparte was perceived as an insult, and anger erupted in Madrid on May 2, 1808, when the population rose up against the French occupation. The uprising was bloodily suppressed, but it was the beacon for nationwide resistance. Soon peasants, priests, and citizens rose up in all regions of Spain. Napoleon had to deal with an opponent who did not fight in big battles, but in countless small battles. Armed groups lurked everywhere, attacking French supply columns, murdering messengers, and attacking isolated soldiers.
This form of small-scale warfare, which was later given the name guerrilla, derived from the Spanish word for small war, was new in Europe and posed enormous problems for the French army. An army that was accustomed to playing out its superiority in open field battles now found itself in a grueling war without clear fronts. But it was not only the guerrillas who caused problems for the French. Regular British troops under Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, also intervened in the conflict. From Portugal, they led a series of campaigns that put increasing pressure on the French occupation. The Battle of Vimeiro in 1808 showed that the British were willing to use Spain as a bridgehead against Napoleon. In the years that followed, the Iberian Peninsula developed into a battlefield where French troops were tied up, which would have been desperately needed elsewhere. Napoleon himself moved to Spain in 1808 to stabilize the situation. With his usual energy, he fought several battles, defeated the Spanish armies, and invaded Madrid again. Militarily, he seemed to regain control, but the country eluded his rule. No sooner had he pacified a region than resistance flared up elsewhere. The war became an endless cycle of uprisings, punitive expeditions, and new revolts. The brutality of this war was extraordinary. French troops reacted harshly to guerrilla attacks, burned down villages, shot suspects, and did not shy away from massacres. But this violence only strengthened the hatred of the population and drove new fighters into the ranks of the guerrillas. At the same time, the resistance groups, which often treated captured Frenchmen cruelly, also became brutal. The Spanish War was a war without mercy, in which the civilian population suffered the most. For Napoleon, Spain was a swamp that dragged him deeper and deeper into it. Instead of a quick solution, the war developed into a conflict that lasted for years, tying up hundreds of soldiers. While he won victories in Central Europe, control slipped away from him here. The term Spanish ulcer, the Spanish ulcer, made the rounds and became the symbol of a wound that never healed. Politically, the war also proved to be devastating. He destroyed Napoleon's reputation as a liberator who wanted to bring freedom and progress to the peoples of Europe. In Spain, he was not seen as a modernizer, but as a foreign ruler who overthrew his own dynasty and exploited the country. The church, which he had pacified in France, openly opposed him in Spain and mobilized believers to resist. Thus, the war also became a struggle for identity and faith, something that Napoleon had underestimated with his rational and pragmatic policies. As the situation progressed, the situation worsened. The British under Wellington were increasingly successful, while the French generals were worn down in endless battles. Battles such as Talavera in 1809 or Salamanca in 1812 showed that the French were not invincible. Finally, the British offensive, combined with the unbroken guerrilla war, forced the French troops to retreat step by step. In 1814, they left Spain for good, defeated, exhausted, and with a considerable loss of prestige. The war in Spain was more than just a sideshow. It was a foretaste of what Napoleon would later experience in Russia, the resistance of an entire people who would not allow themselves to be subjugated by military victories. The guerrilla tactics that were used on a large scale for the first time set a precedent and showed that even the most powerful army could fail when it came up against a people who were ready to fight in every valley, in every village, and in every field. For Napoleon, Spain remained an open wound. He had tried to control the country through dynastic politics and military strength, but in the end, he failed due to the perseverance and resistance of the people. It was a war that weakened his resources, strengthened his opponents, and shook the image of the invincible emperor.
Chapter 16. The Russian Campaign of 1812. Rise and Fall. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon seemed to be at the height of his power. His empire stretched from Spain to Poland, from the Rhine to the Adriatic. Kings and princes were his vassals. Brothers and relatives ruled in Naples, Westphalia, and Spain. But behind the shiny facade, things were already crumbling. The war in Spain drained his strength. The continental blockade weakened the European economy and created discontent. And even his allies began to doubt. Above all, Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, slipped away from him more and more. The alliance of Tilsit in 1807 had long since broken up. Economic interests and wounded pride led to growing enmity.
Napoleon decided to solve the problem by force, and this was the beginning of one of the most disastrous campaigns in history. In June 1812, the so-called Grande Armée crossed the Memel, the border with Russia. With over 600,000 men, it was the largest army Europe had ever seen. Soldiers from France, Italy, Poland, the Rhine Confederation states, even from Prussia and Austria, who had to reluctantly provide troops, marched under Napoleon's flag. It was a motley army, but in its size lay its weakness. Supplying such a huge army over long distances was a Herculean logistical task that soon reached its limits. Napoleon hoped for a quick, decisive battle. His plan was to confront the Russian army, destroy it in a great battle, and force the Tsar to make peace. But the Russians refused open confrontation. Under General Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, they withdrew, abandoned towns and villages, and destroyed everything that could have been of use to the French. The scorched earth tactic turned the vast plains into an empty, starved land. The Grande Armée marched deeper and deeper into Russia, but instead of a decisive victory, it found hunger, exhaustion, and growing resistance. It was not until the beginning of September that the great battle took place near Borodino, for which Napoleon had longed so much. Around 250,000 men faced each other, and the battle became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Napoleonic Wars. For hours, the battle swayed back and forth. Cannon fire and bayonet attacks claimed tens of thousands of victims. In the end, Napoleon defended the battlefield, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Russian army was not destroyed, but retreated in an orderly manner. Napoleon had not forced a decision, but merely taken another step on an endless march. Shortly afterwards, he reached Moscow. The French soldiers hoped to find peace and supplies in the old Tsarist city, but the Russians had left the city. A few days later, a huge fire broke out that destroyed large parts of Moscow. Whether intentionally laid or caused by chaos is still controversial today. It was a shock for Napoleon. Instead of a victory residence, he found a landscape of ruins that offered him no shelter and no supplies. For weeks he lingered in the burned city, waiting for peace negotiations, but Tsar Alexander refused to talk. The retreat eventually became inevitable. In October, the Grande Armée left Moscow, and now the real catastrophe began. Winter came early and mercilessly. Hunger, cold, and constant attacks by Russian troops decimated the army. Horses died in mass, cannons and wagons had to be left behind. Soldiers froze to death or starved to death. Entire regiments disbanded, and the proud army shrank to a chaotic procession of wretches struggling to survive. A particularly dramatic moment was the crossing of the Berezina in November 1812. The remnants of the army had to cross the river while Russian troops harassed them from all sides. In the freezing cold and under fire, the pioneers erected makeshift bridges over which the soldiers hurriedly streamed. Thousands drowned, were crushed, or shot. Although Napoleon managed to save part of his army, the price was appalling. Of the more than 600,000 men who had moved to Russia in the summer, hardly more than 30,000 returned fit for combat. The rest had fallen, captured, or succumbed to the hardships. It was an unprecedented disaster that destroyed the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. All of Europe saw that the emperor was vulnerable, and his opponents drew new hope. For Napoleon personally, the campaign was a turning point. Although he escaped himself, hurried back to Paris, and raised new armies within a very short time, the aura of the Superman was gone. His dominion had developed a crack that could no longer be closed. The Russian campaign revealed the limits of his power, the impossibility of subjugating a vast country by force, the logistical problems of an army that was too large, and the harshness of a nature that bows to no general. At the same time, the campaign changed the political situation in Europe. Prussia and Austria, hitherto forced allies, began to reconsider their loyalties. Russia became an unshakable adversary, and Britain saw its position confirmed. The fall of the Grande Armée was the beginning of the end of the Napoleonic Empire.
Thus, the Russian campaign of 1812 remains a symbol of hubris and tragic decline. Napoleon had believed that he could overcome any obstacle with his willpower and military brilliance. But in the vastness of Russia, he encountered forces that were stronger than any previous battle: hunger, cold, the determination of a people, and the relentlessness of nature. The dream of a quick victory turned into the nightmare of a catastrophe that shook his empire and sealed his fate.
Chapter 17: The Battle of the Nations near Leipzig and the Decline. The devastating Russian campaign had not only cost Napoleon his best army, but also destroyed the myth of his invincibility. In the years before, he had moved through Europe like an overpowering general, victorious in every battle and changing the map at will. But now he was badly battered. Of the hundreds of thousands who had moved east in 1812, only meager remnants returned. Europe, which had been trembling for a long time, drew new courage. Russia demanded revenge. Prussia recognized the hour of liberation. And even Austria, which had hitherto vacillated between duty and coercion as an ally of Napoleon, turned against him. This set the stage for what was perhaps the greatest battle of the 19th century, the Battle of the Nations near Leipzig. As early as the spring of 1813, Napoleon had tried to recover. With admirable energy, he raised new armies, young recruits who were derisively called Marie Louises, after his wife, since he himself justified the conscription by her signature. He gathered over 200,000 men and initially achieved some successes. At Lutzen and Bautzen, he defeated Russian-Prussian troops and showed that he was still dangerous despite all the losses. But these victories were no longer of the clarity of earlier years. His armies were inexperienced, lacking cavalry, and the old clout. In the summer of 1813, Austria joined the coalition against him. Now Napoleon faced an alliance of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, which was financed by Great Britain. It was the so-called War of Liberation coalition, a formidable force determined to overthrow the French emperor once and for all. Napoleon still had tactical skills, but strategically, he was on the defensive. The opponents avoided open battles in which he could unleash his brilliance and instead relied on superiority and attrition. In October 1813, the decisive battle finally took place. More than 300,000 Allied soldiers gathered near Leipzig, in the heart of Saxony, while Napoleon led about 200,000 men into the field. It was the largest battle Europe had ever seen, and it lasted several days. On October 16, the wrestling began. Napoleon fought with his usual energy, tried to break through the enemy lines, and initially achieved partial success. But the superiority was overwhelming. Every day, new Allied troops poured in, while his own reserves dwindled. Particularly painful was the betrayal of the Saxon troops, who changed sides in the middle of the battle and joined the Allies. This turnaround hit Napoleon hard, because it showed how fragile his rule over the Allies had become. On October 18, the situation came to a head. More than 500,000 men were now on the battlefield in total, and the fighting raged with unprecedented intensity. Cannon fire, cavalry attacks, house-to-house fighting, Leipzig became the scene of an apocalyptic struggle. The decision was made on October 19th. Napoleon had to retreat. But even this retreat turned into a tragedy. At the crossing over the Elster, a bridge exploded too early, so that thousands of his soldiers were cut off and captured. It was a chaotic and bloody withdrawal that sealed the final collapse of the campaign. The losses were staggering. Napoleon lost over 90,000 men, while the Allies also mourned around 50,000 dead and wounded. The dimension of this battle, diversity of the nations involved, and the power of decision made it the Battle of the Nations. For many, it was the symbol of the common European resistance against the French emperor. With Leipzig, Napoleon's final decline began. His armies had been shattered, his allies were turning away, and the Allies were now pushing westward. In the months that followed, they marched across the Rhine, crossed France, and directly threatened Paris. Napoleon fought once again with tireless energy, fought smaller battles, won a battle here and there, but it was hopeless. He could not stop the superior force. In March 1814, the coalition troops were in front of Paris.
The capital, which he had kept untouchable for so long, fell into the hands of his opponents. For Napoleon, this was a personal blow, because he had always seen himself as the one who protected France from foreign powers. Now Russians, Prussian, and Austrians marched through the streets of Paris, and the population, tired of war and exhausted, welcomed the end of the endless bloodshed. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon had to abdicate. At first, he hoped to secure the crown for his young son, but the Allies refused. Instead, they allowed him to remain as ruler of the small Mediterranean island of Elba. For many, this seemed to be the end. The great emperor, who had once ruled half of Europe, was banished to a tiny island. But his story was not over yet. In the hearts of his followers lived the belief in his return, and he himself was not prepared to resign himself to the fate of exile. The Battle of Leipzig, however, remains as the moment when the tide finally turned against him. It was the battle in which all of Europe stood against him, and it was the battle that marked the beginning of his final decline.
Chapter 18: Abdication, Elba, and the 100 Days. After the defeat of Leipzig and the Allied invasion of Paris in the spring of 1814, Napoleon was on the brink of the abyss. His power was shaken, his armies weakened, his allies deserted. On April 6, 1814, he signed the abdication certificate in Fontainebleau, a moment that had an earthquake effect in Europe. The man who had been considered invincible for a decade had fallen. For some, it was a redemption, for others, a deep shock. Napoleon himself accepted defeat only reluctantly. He had hoped to secure the crown for at least his son, little Napoleon II, but the Allies insisted on a complete abdication. The conditions of his exile were unusual. Instead of condemning him or imprisoning him, the victors granted him dominion over the small Mediterranean island of Elba. There he was to reside with a small court and a few hundred soldiers. It was a compromise. On the one hand, he was banned from the big stage of Europe. On the other hand, he was left with a remnant of dignity and power. On April 20, he said goodbye to his guard in the courtyard of Fontainebleau, a scene that went down in history with pathetic words and tears from his soldiers. Once on Elba, Napoleon immediately focused all his energy on the design of the small island. He had roads built, organized the administration, reformed agriculture and mining, as if he wanted to create a small model empire. But the island was narrow, provincial, and it could never satisfy a man like him. From the heights of Elba, he looked out to sea and knew that Europe would not come to rest without him. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbons returned. Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king, ascended the throne. But the restoration quickly proved to be fragile. Many French people had become accustomed to the achievements of the revolution and to the order under Napoleon. The return of the old nobility, the attempt to restore privileges, and the political sluggishness of the new regime were rejected. The soldiers, who had fought under Napoleon's flags for years, felt neglected and dishonored. The situation also remained unstable internationally. At the Congress of Vienna, the powers negotiated a new order in Europe, but there was no unity. Rivalries between Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain made a stable solution difficult. In this climate of uncertainty, Napoleon decided to return. In February 1815, he left Elba. With only about 1,000 men, he landed on the French coast at Gulf Juan on March 1. What followed was a drama of almost unbelievable speed. Instead of arresting or fighting him, the soldiers who met him defected to him in droves. In Grenoble, he faced the royal troops and said, "Soldiers, know me if you will. If one of you wants to kill his emperor, here I am." No one fired. Instead, they joined him. On his march to Paris, his crowd of followers grew like an avalanche. On March 20, Napoleon entered Paris. Louis XVIII had fled, and the people rejoiced. The return of the emperor, later referred to as the 100 Days, began. Napoleon presented himself as a prince of peace who only wanted to rule France and not wage a new war. He promised reforms, a more liberal constitution, and sought the support of the nation. But the European powers reacted with horror. At the Congress of Vienna, they immediately declared him an outlaw and vowed to destroy him once and for all.
Napoleon now faced the greatest challenge. He had to defend his empire before the overpowering opponents united. With astonishing energy, he again organized an army that in a short time comprised over 200,000 men. Many of his old soldiers returned, excited at the thought of fighting under their emperor once more. But he knew he didn't have time. So he decided to launch a preemptive strike against the British-Prussian troops in Belgium before the Russians and Austrians could advance. The decision was made in June 1815, at Waterloo. On 18 June, Napoleon's troops met the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. The battle was hard fought. At first, it seemed as if Napoleon could achieve victory. But delays, rain, and the late arrival of the Prussians turned the tide. In the evening, his army collapsed. Waterloo became a catastrophe that finally ended his rule. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time, there were no more compromises. He wanted to flee to America, but the British captured him and sent him far away to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, an exile from which there was to be no return. Nevertheless, the 100 Days remained a unique chapter in his history. They showed the unbroken attraction he exerted on France and its soldiers. Within a few weeks, he had swept away the old order and brought the country back under his banners. But they also revealed the limits of his power. Europe stood united against him, and his time was up. Napoleon himself later said, "From the summit of greatness, I fell into the abyss. But it will be said that I have been emperor for 20 years, and my reign will not pass away." The abdication, Elba, and the 100 Days were the last rebellion of a man who wanted to make history, and did so, even in his downfall.
Chapter 19: Waterloo and the Final End. June 18, 1815 is a date that has been indelibly etched in Europe's memory. On this day, near the Belgian village of Waterloo, the battle took place that finally sealed Napoleon's fate. He had often been close to destruction, had suffered defeats, and yet always found his way back. But this time, there was to be no return. Waterloo became the emperor's last stage, the culmination of his greatness and his fall. The prehistory began with his spectacular return from Elba. Within a few weeks, he had brought France back under his control. But Europe reacted decisively. At the Congress of Vienna, the powers that be declared him an outlaw and swore to fight him together. Napoleon knew he didn't have time. If he waited, the overpowering opponents from Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain would join forces and crush him. So he decided to go on the offensive. His plan was to defeat the British and Prussian armies in Belgium before the others arrived. With over 120,000 men, he marched north in June 1815. On 16 June, he defeated the Prussians at Ligny, while his Marshal Ney stopped the British at Quatre Bras, but without decisive success. Napoleon hoped to have pushed the Prussians back far enough to then turn completely to the British. But he underestimated the tenacity of the opponents and the difficulties of coordination within his own army. On the morning of 18 June, he faced the Anglo-Dutch troops under Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, at Waterloo. Rain had turned the fields into mud, making it difficult to deploy his cavalry and artillery. Napoleon hesitated to attack, hoping that the terrain would dry up, a hesitation that would later be his undoing, as it gave the Prussians time to regroup and advance. The battle began around noon with an attack on the fortified positions of the Allies. The French stormed the Huguenot farmstead, but it did not fall despite fierce fighting. Again and again, Napoleon's soldiers threw themselves against the British lines, but Wellington defended itself tenaciously. The French cavalry under Marshal Ney led daring attacks, but they failed in the cannon fire and in the stable infantry squares of the British. Ney, the bravest of the brave, fought with passion, but his attacks fizzled out without decisive success. In the afternoon, Napoleon sent his elite unit, the Imperial Guard, into the field. Those men who were considered invincible and whose mere presence was often enough to decide a battle. But this time, they collided with the stubborn British lines. Wellington, who had masterfully restrained his troops, had them advance at the decisive moment. The Guard was beaten back, a shock for the entire French army.
The cry of, "The guard is giving way," spread panic. At the same time, the Prussians under Blücher arrived on the battlefield. They fell into the French flank and increased the pressure on Napoleon's exhausted troops. Now the French resistance became chaos. What was planned as a great decisive victory turned into a disaster. The army broke up, soldiers fled in all directions, and the once so feared Grande Armée disintegrated. Napoleon himself remained on the field until the end, trying to restore order, but it was in vain. He had to realize that all was lost. During the night, he retreated while his army disintegrated. Waterloo was not only a defeat, it was the final collapse of his military power. The consequences were immediate. On 22nd June, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time, there was no more room for maneuver, no possibility of returning. He initially hoped to escape to the United States, but the British intercepted him. They decided not to tolerate him again in Europe and not to detain him on a Mediterranean island like Elba. Instead, they took him to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the South Atlantic from which there was no escape. He was to spend the rest of his life there. Waterloo was more than a military defeat. It was the end of an era. With the fall of Napoleon, the old dynasties returned to France, and the powers of Europe reorganized the continent. The Congress of Vienna, which had just met, was now able to complete its work. The restoration of the old order, at least as far as it was still possible after a quarter of a century of revolution and war. For France, Waterloo meant disillusionment. After 20 years of war, the country was exhausted, its finances ruined, its population worn down. But at the same time, it had had experiences that could no longer be erased. The ideas of civil rights, equality before the law, and national pride that lived on even under the Restoration. Napoleon himself saw Waterloo as a misfortune, as a chain of unfortunate circumstances, not as a defeat of his genius. Later he said, "Waterloo will not decide world history. My life has left traces that will not be erased." But the reality was merciless. Waterloo was the point at which his power collapsed. The battlefield remained a symbol and a myth at the same time. For the victors, a triumph over the tyrant. For his followers, a place of tragic greatness. The Lion Monument still stands there today, commemorating the decisive battle. Waterloo is thus more than a place. It has become synonymous with the final failure of a dream.
Chapter 20. Napoleon's Legacy, Myth, Criticism, and Aftermath. When Napoleon was taken to the distant island of St. Helena after the defeat of Waterloo, his story seemed to be over. There, far from the centers of power, he lived in seclusion and under constant surveillance. But while his body was trapped on a small rocky island in the South Atlantic, his mind began to permeate Europe and the world. Hardly any other ruler has embodied so many contradictions, left so many traces, and hardly anyone has been so glorified into a myth after his fall as Napoleon Bonaparte. His legacy is complex, full of light and shadow, and it continues to have an impact today. At first, his military greatness remains undisputed. Napoleon was a master of battle, a strategist who took opponents by surprise with speed, deception, and the skillful use of his troops, and overcame seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, these names still stand for genius on the battlefield today. Military academies around the world still study his campaigns, and his methods influence the art of war in the 19th and 20th centuries. But his victories were dearly bought. Millions of soldiers and civilians died in the endless wars he fought. In many European countries, he is therefore considered not only a genius, but also a destroyer, the embodiment of bloodshed. His political legacy is just as ambivalent. In France, he left behind structures that can still be felt today. The Code Civil, the Napoleonic Code, is considered one of his greatest achievements. It created a unified legal system that enshrined equality before the law, the protection of property, and the abolition of feudal privileges. This code was not only introduced in France, but in many parts of Europe that were under its rule. Even after its fall, it remained in existence and shaped the legal system well into the modern era. In Germany, Italy, and even in countries outside Europe, it had an effect. Napoleon also reformed administration and education. He created a centralized bureaucracy that worked efficiently and gave stability to the state. Its university and school systems encouraged achievement and discipline. At the same time, he strengthened the principle of the modern nation-state. While he himself did not strive for the unity of Germany or Italy, his rule there awakened the idea of national self-determination. In doing so, he unintentionally laid the foundation for developments that would later shape the 19th century. But there is also the other side. Napoleon was not an advocate of democracy, but an autocrat. He used referendums to legitimize his power, but the results were mostly controlled. He consistently suppressed freedom of the press, freedom of opinion, and political opposition. He presented himself as the heir to the revolution, but in reality, he put many of its ideals aside when they stood in the way of his rule. Critics therefore see him as a dictator who preached freedom but exercised rule. His relationship to religion was characterized by pragmatism. With the Concordat of 1801, he pacified the church, but at the same time tied it firmly to the state. For many Catholics, he brought order and stability. For others, he was a ruler who saw religion only as a tool. This also shows the dual character of his legacy. He created peace between church and state, but not out of faith, but out of political calculation. Internationally, Napoleon left behind a Europe that was deeply shaken. His wars destroyed old structures, but they also created new ones. The Holy Roman Empire disappeared, the Confederation of the Rhine and the reorganization of Germany prepared the future foundation of the empire. In Spain, his intervention sparked a people's war that strengthened the idea of national identity. In Poland, he awakened hopes for independence, but this remained unfulfilled. Even in Latin America, his wars had an indirect effect. When Spain was weakened, colonies seized the opportunity to fight for their independence. The myth of Napoleon began when he was still alive. For his soldiers, he was the little corporal who shared their sufferings, who could inspire them with a few words, and who promised them fame and booty. For his opponents, he was the monster of Corsica that subjugated all of Europe. After his fall, Romanticism glorifies him. Poets, painters, and musicians made him the symbolic figure of the superhuman hero who failed because of his own greatness. His death in 1821 on St. Helena finally turned him into a legend. In France, his postmodern fame remained particularly alive. Movements soon arose demanding his return. In 1840, his mortal remains were ceremoniously transferred from St. Helena to Paris and buried in the Invalides, an event that was cheered by thousands. Even today, visitors make pilgrimages to his grave, which looks like a sanctuary of French national pride. But the memory of him is still controversial today. Some see him as the great reformer who founded modern Europe. Others see the tyrant who led millions to ruin. He was revolutionary and emperor, liberator and oppressor, genius and despot at the same time. Perhaps this is precisely where the fascination lies, that Napoleon does not fit into simple categories, but embodies the contradictions of history in a single person. His legacy continues to have an effect today. Many European states owe their modern structures to it, whether in administration, law, or education. At the same time, the memory of the horrors of his wars remain a warning. Waterloo may have sealed his end, but Napoleon himself remains immortal. As a symbol of the possibilities and dangers of human greatness, as a memorial to hubris, and as a legend that fascinates generations to this day.